Detective Morrison dreaded this visit. How could she tell Anita Schulter that her daughter was missing? This was the hardest part of police work, breaking bad news to good people. Detective Morrison and Spike had rushed to Safeco Field as soon as the call came in. A security guard, so upset he was barely coherent, had dialed 911 to report a girl had vanished from the ballpark. At first, Detective Morrison assumed it was a typical lost child case, and she wondered why Seattle police were alerting her. Kids often get separated from the group they came with, but usually they're reunited quickly with no harm done. It's easy to get turned around in crowded places. Happens all the time. Detective Morrison had been on her first break of the busy day when the call came, and her ham sandwich seemed more interesting than a kid who went out the wrong exit at the ballpark. She only half listened to the report until she heard the name of the missing girl. She concentrated on the words coming from the police radio. This girl is the sister of 6-year-old Matt Schulter, who vanished from his high school 8 days ago. Detective Morrison dropped her sandwich and ran to her squad car, en route to Safeco Field with her siren screaming. She learned Bonnie had left her seat in the 6th inning and never returned. When Detective Morrison arrived, she found a group of girls, plus a few adults, milling nervously around the private office of Safeco Field official. She recognized Bonnie's pal Nancy. 2 Seattle Police Department officers were already questioning the group. Bonnie told me she saw someone she knew, a friend of her mom's, Nancy said. She said she was going to talk to him and she would meet me back at our seats, but she never came. Someone she knew. Detective Morrison had wondered all along if the person who took Matt was someone he recognized. A family friend or a former neighbor. Someone whom Matt would go with because he didn't consider the person to be a stranger, as he'd been warned against. Had Bonnie now been lured by the same familiar person? Detective Morrison felt sick to her stomach. Bonnie was a smart, capable girl. She would never willingly leave the ballpark, even with someone she knew, without first telling the people she'd come with. It flat out would not happen, which meant Bonnie had left against her will. After questioning Bonnie's team and the chaperones, the 3 police officers left, each with an urgent assignment. Detective Morrison offered to do the worst task of all, inform Bonnie's mother, because she already knew Anita Schulter. The rain began again as Detective Morrison drove out of downtown Seattle and headed east across the Mercer Island Bridge. By the time she stopped in front of the Schulter house, her mood matched the dismal weather. With a heavy heart, Detective Morrison rang Anita Schulter's doorbell. Mrs. Schulter took one look at the detective's face, and she knew she brought bad news. "Come in," she said. "It's Bonnie." She told her friend she saw someone she recognized and would be back in a few minutes. She never returned. The color drained from Mrs. Schulter's face. "Bonnie's gone?" "She's missing." As soon as the Seattle police got the call, they ordered roadblocks around the whole district. They're checking every car in the parking garage. Those who parked on the street will be searched before they leave the area. Mrs. Schulter nodded, as if she understood, but Detective Morrison knew the woman was too shocked to pay full attention. "Bonnie left the others during the bottom of the 6th inning," Detective Morrison continued. "They didn't report her missing until the game had ended, nearly an hour later. Until then, her group thought she was watching the game with a friend that she'd seen. They didn't start to worry until the crowd began to thin out. Then they looked for her and realized she wasn't coming back to her original seat. So Bonnie could have left the area before the roadblocks went up," Mrs. Schulter said. "Correct. Do you think the same person who took Matt managed to take Bonnie?" "We can't be sure, but it's awfully suspicious. It makes me wonder again if Matt recognized his abductor." If the same person was after Bonnie, he must have followed her to the Mariners game. How could someone have stalked her like that? Where was Matt while this happened? Chills crept up Detective Morrison's arms. Was Matt dead, and now the killer had come for Bonnie? Was this revenge on Mrs. Schulter? by someone with a twisted mind or an old grudge? We don't know if Matt is still with his abductor, Detective Morrison said. Then, seeing Mrs. Schulter's stricken look, she added, the kidnapper could have left Matt locked in somewhere or had someone guarding him. Or maybe Matt was there. Maybe Bonnie saw him and followed him. Bonnie's grandpa, who'd listened to the whole conversation, said, perhaps the abductor used Matt as a decoy to get Bonnie to go with him, the same way he used Pookie to trick Matt. You think Matt was at the ball game in plain view of thousands of people? Mrs. Schulter said. Surely someone would have recognized him. Besides, if he'd been out in public, he would have screamed for help. And if Bonnie would have seen him, she would have called the police immediately. Detective Morrison nodded. Mrs. Schulter was right. On the other hand, if Bonnie had not left the ballpark voluntarily, it meant she'd been kidnapped. How could that happen to a 13-year-old girl in a crowded baseball stadium? Bonnie would have never left the game without consulting Mrs. Tagg, Mrs. Schulter said. Detective Morrison knew this girl, knew this family, and she knew in her bones that Mrs. Schulter spoke the truth. Bonnie could be trusted to do the right thing. What had happened? What in the world could have seemed so important to Bonnie that she would go against everything she'd been taught, especially now, with her brother missing? Grandpa said, whoever went with them had a weapon and forced her to leave the stadium. Grandma said she wouldn't have gone otherwise. Detective Morrison believed they were right. There's no point speculating what happened, she said. The important thing now is to find Bonnie, and as fast as possible. I'll need a picture of her. It was like watching a rerun of a horrible movie where she stood in the Schulter's living room asking for a photo of a missing child. This time was worse because she knew the child personally, knew her and liked her. Throughout her 9 years on the police force, Detective Morrison had purposely maintained a detachment from the people she served. She knew if she let herself get emotionally involved in the cases she worked, she would burn out and not be able to continue. Over the last week, however, Bonnie's loyalty to her brother and concern for her dog had touched Detective Morrison. The girl had distributed flyers, checked websites, knocked on doors, given interviews, and sent emails. She never gave up. Bonnie Schulter was more than another missing person. She was a missing friend. When Mrs. Schulter handed over the picture of her daughter, her second child to vanish in 8 days, Detective Morrison's heart broke for the woman. No one should have to endure what this family was going through.